Good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Anna Svensdotter. I am from the Australian Institute of Architects, Queensland Chapter, and tonight I'm very excited to bring you a long overdue presentation of the 2018 and 2019 recipients of the Philip Y Bisset Scholarship. Before we get started with our presentations, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. The Royal Australian Institute of Architects recognises the unceded sovereign lands and rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of the lands and waters on which we meet today. This recognition generates acknowledgement and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander countries, cultures and communities, and their ways of being, knowing and doing. Caring for country practices, including architecture and place shaping, have existed on this continent since time immemorial. The Institute recognises a professional commitment to engage and act meaningfully through reciprocal partnerships and relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Together we will support and develop the emergence of new possibilities for our shared futures. The Philip Y Bisset Planning and Architecture Scholarship marks the beginning of a philanthropic strategy for architectural education in Queensland that work to ensure its continued growth and vitality. The bequest helps to foster the highest quality of design for our state's built environment. The scholarship maintains an ongoing educational program that, managed wisely, will see a perpetuity of investment in our young Queensland architect for many years into the future. The purpose of the Philip Y Bisset Scholarship is to enable final year students to undertake a course of study, research or other proposed activity approved by the selection panel to study architecture overseas with particular emphasis on the planning and design of buildings. This evening we are joined by three of our excellent Bisset scholars. These three scholars were awarded the scholarship in 2018 and 2019, and due to the COVID pandemic's interruption of international travel, some travelled before COVID and some travelled after COVID, restricted our travel international. So that's the reason why we're only in 2023 getting to the point where we're finally getting to see these excellent projects presented to you. So as a way of quick introduction, we have Ryan Browning, who travelled to Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, Spain and UK during his scholarship. His project is titled Design Trends in Hospitals and Open Building Research in Healthcare Across Europe. We then have Nicholas Russell, whose project is titled Reclaiming the Street, Looking Back to Inform the Future. Nicholas travelled to Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Oslo, Stuttgart, Paris, Barcelona and London. And finally we have Claire Baisley, whose project is titled Significant Sites in Contemporary Heritage Architecture. Claire travelled to Portland, New York, Madrid, London, Manchester and Zurich. And without further ado, I will be happy to hand over the baton of this presentation to Ryan Browning. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, good evening, everyone. So my trip originally was planned around the idea of the hospital, and I guess I sort of fell into that pathway. First sort of long-term job was working on a hospital, and sort of fell in love with the complexity and challenges that relates to that and the fact that it's a social infrastructure. And my original topic was about this idea of open building, which is sort of this idea of endless flexibility within buildings. And there's sort of a bit of a hub for that within sort of Southern Europe. Unfortunately, I was sort of disrupted by COVID in my trip. And that had a couple of effects. One, I've sort of worked within the industry, got my registration, and sort of been, more involved in healthcare, got more interested in it. But also it meant that a few of the contacts that I had were no longer working anymore, and within Europe, as well as getting inside hospitals became really difficult in some countries or impossible. So I couldn't really focus the topic on the inside bits and the flexibility, but I also got this more sort of, I guess, pressing idea about how a hospital fits within its context and relates to its community, which is sort of a really big topic within sort of the space, is how do you actually activate the hospital with the community. And so I was always planned to go across Europe. So I actually went to 21 cities on my trip. All the red ones are places where I visited a or a few hospitals. And the black ones were where I went to visit the city itself, and then the architecture in that city. Um, so it wasn't exclusively hospitals, I'll admit that. There was a lot of sightseeing, being a tourist, going to, the buildings you read about in magazines, and the sort of the more famous buildings and historic buildings within Europe. But it also had this sort of tie back to the hospital and how that fits within some of these older cities. Um, oh, there we go. So I started off in London. I was there for 8 days or so, with the main premise of attending the European Health Design Conference, which is sort of the global leading conference in that the sort of the space. Um, and ironically, while I was there, I got sick because, every time you fly, you get sick. So I couldn't attend the final day, which was meant to be a site visit to GOSH, which is one of the largest children's hospitals in the world. But I did get to attend the entire conference, and there was really interesting topics. It brought people in from the States, from all across Europe, from Australia, from New Zealand. Um, and I guess some of the key takeaways was that we design buildings, but really the health systems that we design them in, and the building legislations that we have to design around, are direct determinants on the architectural outcomes. And that was really prevalent in countries, say, like Denmark, where there's like a legislation that if you're working in a space for more than 2 hours, you have a right to natural light, or a view to outside, which means that you end up with really skinny buildings, or with buildings with lots of courtyards or light wells to bring that light in. And it really changes how those buildings are created, especially when you compare them to, say, an Australian hospital, which we would all have a experience of or have seen, sort of the big block, I guess, is what they generally become. And the other thing that was really interesting is that the European hospital tends to be low-rise campus sort of models, or sprawling flat plates within their context. And that amongst academics within Europe, the vertical hospital, which is the most common hospital that we design in Australia, is very like commercialized and American and Australian, and they don't quite get why we do it. So there's actually a really interesting sort of trend. It's very driven by efficiency, but potentially it might not be the greatest outcome. And then obviously the best buildings do focus on the human-centric spaces and qualities. So all the award winners at the conference had really human-focused designs, and they were the most appealing to watch and the most appealing talks to attend. I'm going to jump across my trip a bit because we've only got a short period of time and there was a lot of places to see. So this hospital is in Barcelona. It's literally on the beach at Barceloneta. And it's Hospital del Mar. It's and by literally on the beach, this is the promenade that walks along the beach, this photo, and down the end is the casino. And it is effectively like every other hospital. It's been built over time. There's the old buildings, there's the modernist tower, and then there's all these new buildings that have been attached. And this view is the outpatients building, which sits effectively affronting the promenade. And the really interesting thing about this building is that the corridor, as you go into your consult room, is actually looking out over the beach. So you have that direct connection to the people visiting the hospital, but you also have that direct connection back out to where you are at the beach. And this sort of satellite image, as you can see, it's beach is along there. There's a very clear promenade. There's that building which becomes the consult area. And then as you go through that building, there's all these open courtyards which form the main entry. So rather than having this big grand main entry space, it actually becomes a set of pavilions and a set of spaces for patients and families and staff members to have their lunch break with the cool sea breezes coming in through the arcade underneath that building. Directly next door, so the garden sort of to the bottom of the hospital is a park which is full of people, doing their weekly fitness. And then obviously down on the beach, you have people running, or as many people doing calisthenics as you'll ever see in your life. Like, it's really engaged, and this idea of a hospital and health and outdoors really something sort of coming together. They're currently under construction of a new building that's sort of wraps around the sort of southwest of the site, and it's factoring in a new emergency department and some new wards down the back. But it's really light, sort of airflow, shade, light and shade sort of architecture that gives a scale to the building. So obviously this is a shot from the back of the park. The beach is sort of in the distance of this shot, but you've got the taller buildings at the back of the site, so that your I guess your view from the beach is not of the big tall hospital, but those buildings still get the benefit of the view out over towards the water. And then this is a view from within the park. So yeah, you've got your people out doing their sort of PT, but then the scale of the hospital to the edge of the park is actually quite low. And there's a little bit of connection in that you can see in, and you can see the corridors beyond, and there's people in their scrubs having their dinner while everyone's sort of out exercising. And so it becomes a part of the area. Also in Barcelona is Hospital St. Pau. This one's quite interesting in that it's sort of in a much more residential setting. It's not by the beach, but it's sort of in the modernist area of Barcelona. But what's kind of interesting is its connections to the city and its sort of connection to heritage. So this is, it's a very new looking building. The shot on the right is as you walk out of the metro. So straight out of the metro and you can walk in the main entry. It's a pretty good connection. But what's really interesting is it's actually a new sort of hospital, world-class facility that sits atop and above a heritage listed campus, which was actually the operating hospital until 2007. And down the sort of the central spine is a direct view and view line to La Sagrada Familia. And each street and each building sit at the same height. So the apartment complex is the 5-story sort of apartment complexes. They sit at the same height as the buildings adjacent. So it's all very neat and tidy, even though it is a sort of a very contemporary looking building. And this is sort of the older hospital. It's an Art Nouveau brick architecture, but it's a really interesting piece in that it's lots of little sort of Nightingale type wards that sit by themselves. There's greenery in between, there's walkways in between. So connection to outside, natural ventilation, skinny plans, really interesting architecture, really interesting spaces. The bottom right is one of the old wards, and it's got a mosaic ceiling, like it's something, and it's big and open air, and something you wouldn't expect in a hospital at all when you consider it to the Australian context. And to think that they were using these buildings up until 2007, and it's all interconnected in the bottom middle photo by this underground network of tunnels that sort of popped you up into the middle of these wards, so that all of the business went on underneath, which is sort of a common thing in hospital design. And then the patients were all sort of in these really quite quaint, beautiful buildings. Now jumping to Venice. So when I was in Venice, I also went to the Biennale, so it was a good little combo effort there. But tucked behind a Renaissance sort of facade is quite a large hospital that you don't actually really notice because it just blends into the surroundings. Its architecture is very similar to the residential buildings around, and it's sort of this courtyard area down in the bottom middle of the page. And why I've taken a really zoomed out shot here is that it has a direct link over the water to the cemetery. So as a city planning sort of perspective, really easy way of, I guess in the older days, sort of fulfilling all of the sort of logistical needs of a hospital when you've got, I guess, a canal city. But one of the other things about how the hospital connected to the city is, it's Venice, we're in boats, so the ambulances are canal boats. But then how do you get a canal boat into a hospital? So sort of on the back side of the building, looking away from the city, is sort of this portico, which is in the bottom left. And the boats go in there, they drop the patient off, and then there's roll down shutters and alarms that go off so that you have the patient privacy as they bring the patient in. But you're still being able to get people in and out quickly in a city that's defined by, their canals. And as you can see, it is very much just a simple, very quite old building, but it just fits in its context. It's nothing outrageous, but it actually has quite a large capacity. Then jumping up to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So Erasmus University Medical Center is what's interesting about this site, and you'll see it in the satellite image about to come up, is it's a lot of different buildings that are connected by a sort of a new mega hospital. But they've done so in a way that it all comes together. Like it's quite a sort of a tapestry, and you can see it in the facades. So this is all new building portions, but they're quite similar, but they're different, but they're modular, so you can do whatever you need to do within the hospital. But it sort of creates this language, and it is quite a large building, like it's massive. But it doesn't feel massive because of the way that the facade's been done, the planning's been done around it, and you sort of walk through the building to get into the building. So you walk under these portals of, I guess, concrete building, through glass, and then into sort of what is a pretty amazing hospital street. So it sits quite close to a lot of the museums, and VRDV's new reflective gallery store sits just off the main avenue that takes you down towards the hospital. There's an older children's hospital. There's a couple of old modernist towers on the site, and then it's all been brought together with this continuous hospital street that is sort of a fully glazed, like covered area. But what's kind of unique about it is that it spans between the two buildings that are either side of it or within the new building that has been built. So your facade comes inside the building of some of the older buildings or of the new buildings. So you sort of get to understand where you are within the hospital street without actually having to go outside. You've still got the benefit of not being freezing cold in winter. And it's a really clear sort of circulation strategy. And off that hospital street on the right here are sort of these healing gardens that are extraordinarily quiet spaces. They become light wells to get light into some of the departments. And you have this connection when you're in there back to the hospital. You can see, a doctor working in their office, or you can see a procedure room. But you're also exposed to quite a nice place full of plants. And there's like little signs that, say this plant is from this country, etc. So it's about bringing in nature inside the hospital in climates where you can't go outside the hospital sometimes. And then again, how that language works. So the building sort of zigzags around the site, picking up all the other existing buildings. But this is sort of the newer portion, and using the different forms of modular facades to create a greater language that brings the scale somewhat down from being quite an extremely large hospital. Then to Copenhagen. So we're moving around a bit at the moment. So Rigshospitalet is sort of the main hospital in the middle of Copenhagen. It's walking distance from the center of town. And it's kind of like a lot of our hospitals. It has, the modernist tower in the middle of the site. But it's got some really interesting new buildings on the site. Particularly this sort of is the main new acute facility, which sort of has this tessellating folding precast, or not precast, tiled facade. And what's interesting is it actually comes across as quite a large building, but it folds in and out. And it's actually a really skinny building because they're trying to get their light in. The best thing about it is its scale fits within its context. It's got 5-story, 6-story apartment buildings either side and a park to the other sides. And it's set back enough from the street that the fact that it's 7 to 8 stories doesn't overpower the area where the modernist tower sort of starts to become a bit offensive. As you can see in this one, the building sort of steps in and out and over the top of itself and weaves, bringing in light wells and light opportunities. And when you look at an aerial or a plan of it, it's only a grid or two wide. It's quite a skinny building, but they've weaved it into being quite a compact and efficient space. And then towards the back of the side is the existing children's hospital. And the great part about this is that each bedroom is actually on the bottom of the building. So there's a park opposite, which is where this tree is. But they have doors and they can go out onto their own veranda with their own sort of veranda chair. So they have the capacity to open the door up, or a family member could open the door up and go to the balcony. Something that we don't really get in Australia. And this crane on the side is going to be the new children's hospital, which is like a starfish plan building, more bedrooms effectively. They talked about it in the conference, quite an interesting building. But the really cool part about it was this is the very front lawn of the hospital. And they had a prototype of effectively what the lounge living area is going to be on the front lawn of the hospital that's being built, so that the community can have an engagement with it. It's not done somewhere else. It's not done in a hidden meeting room. It's right on show, so staff members, community can see what's coming, and you actually build that sense of ownership. And then finally, hopefully I'm not running too far over, is Karolinska University Hospital in Sweden, Stockholm. And this is by definition a mega hospital. It's got something like 1,400 beds, loads and loads of operating theatres, 6 or 7 MRIs. Like, it is incredibly large, and the campus itself is even larger. It was like a PPP, which is kind of interesting because I'm now working on one. You sort of get to understand the concept. My camera also died and my phone was about to die, so I don't have that many photos of it. But it it is an immense site. So that photo before was taken down here. It's this new building along here. But then the actual site sort of flows through, and there's old hospital buildings, institutes, research institutes, etc., that take up this massive site. There's sort of an extension of a university-style research institute campus across the main road. To the north, there's again the cemetery, which then continues on to become part of the park, the great sort of parkland to the north of the city. It is a big building. It's not necessarily fitting in directly with its context. It's serving the purpose of being a big hospital. But what's really nice about it is when you come into the main entry, it's just scaled to a proportion that, yes, it's a large building, and yes, it's a big main entry, but you don't get the full exposure to the entire size of that hospital. And one of the greatest parts is as you walk in the front door, you see this amazing artwork on the wall, and then that sort of takes you to the stairwell, which takes you up to sort of your main circulation space through the building. So using art and light and scale to draw people in and make people more comfortable. And as you can see, this is around the other side of the building, really large building, but and potentially not the greatest piece of architecture ever, but there's light, there's scale, and the actual spaces you occupy are sort of scaled down from the immensity of the hospital. And of course, the trip wasn't all about hospitals. There was plenty of other buildings along the way, plenty of other experiences, and plenty of other cities, and all around a really great trip. So that's me.
So first off, I'd like to just say that I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity that the Philip Y Bisset Scholarship afforded me, particularly to the selection panel for supporting my proposal, but also to my mentors on the trip, Dr. Ashley Payne and Dr. Leah Catherine Zacher, who guided my research and also provided some valuable advice and also contacts on my travels. The last few years of global pandemic has shifted the focus away from issues of preservation, and I wondered during this time about the legacy of the transformative experiences of the trip I took in early 2019. However, the realities of a climate emergency and the impact of ongoing housing insecurity suggests the significant role architecture can play in larger public policy debates. The findings of my trip suggest this should not be divorced from the retention of existing culturally significant places. It also happened that during the preparation of this presentation, I attended this year's national conference, and I heard from Denise Scott Brown, who referenced some planned renovations to the Sainsbury wing at the British National Gallery, which she designed with her partner, Robert Venturi. And I'd encourage anyone on this call to have a look at the proposed work and also sign the petition shown on the screen to try and halt those proposed changes, because it was for this, for a very similar reason that I started this research in the first place all those years ago. The original premise of my trip was that the recent swathe of listings of postmodern architecture or buildings from the 1980s and 90s may prove a problem for canonical heritage practices. I based this proposal on my master's thesis research, which focused particularly on how these buildings' relative youth implicated ideas about value based solely on a building's age and the nostalgia, patina, and material significance that comes with this. These buildings are not made of beautiful stone, and in general, postmodern buildings have not aged well. My chosen example of this was the Portland building, which was at the time of my thesis undergoing a radical renovation to replace its iconic external skin with a new weatherproof cladding. This project is now complete and the building looks largely the same, but the process ignited significant backlash from local heritage professionals and the listing authority, the National Heritage Register, which threatened to delist the project as a result. The trip afforded me the opportunity to visit this building by Michael Graves alongside a number of other significant examples which had been heritage listed and were undergoing significant renovations, including the AT&T building by Philip Johnson in New York and the No. 1 Poultry building by James Sterling in London. The trip also coincided with a conference entitled Preserving the Recent Past, held in LA, which is a third in the series after a 19-year hiatus. The conference's premise is somewhat self-evident in the title and aligned very neatly with the aims of my own research, although stopping somewhat short of the postmodern period. In general, the issues of preserving postmodern architecture was new to many of the professionals I met, and the challenges of these buildings listings was raw to those who had been involved. Researchers in the Heritage Chair at Delft noted they were only just starting to look at buildings from the 1970s as they approached 50 years of age. And my own research had demonstrated the ubiquity of minimum age thresholds since the very inception of heritage practice was an issue of resource management rather than a reflection on significance. And this definitely held true during my trip. However, much as Ryan's trip involved many detours as an Australian travelling overseas, my trip was not without a few additional stops. Cheap flights with stopovers in Hawaii and Lisbon, and old and new friends in San Fran, Zurich, Rotterdam, and Madrid. A lot of cold call emails to academics whose research I'd admired, along with recommendations and contacts from people I already knew and met, generated a long list of fascinating meetings, interviews, and tours. And referencing a prestigious sounding research scholarship proved to be a powerful tool. So I thought rather than trace the many conversations and experiences of this trip, I would attempt to summarize some overarching themes and theories that emerged through the research, but also in the 4 years since I went on my travels. This also, I think, helped me to understand the relevance of this work, particularly to my recent years in practice. So the first theme I'd like to talk about is that recent history is also personal history. My original research identified that postmodern places benefited from a high level of detail in surviving documents and sometimes living architects who understood the original design intent and the specifics of a project's realization. So unlike buildings from the distant past, kind of buildings that heritage practitioners are used to, the preservation of these structures would not contend with conjecture. However, what came to the fore was that many of these details were not necessarily supportive of preservation. The surviving architect's perspectives may contradict heritage process and advocate for radical change. And in some cases, the architect's personality itself was a roadblock to preservation. When I was in New York, I met with Liz Waitkus, the director of Docomomo US, who championed the campaign against proposed changes to the AT&T building. In 2018, architecture firm Snøhetta submitted proposals to glass wash the podium level of the iconic building in an effort to create a more inviting street front. However, the local chapter of Docomomo in New York refused to advocate for the building, citing differences of opinion with the original architect. Johnson was a divisive figure, both philosophically due to his controversial turn towards postmodernism, and also maybe not the nicest person to deal with in other ways. So why fight to preserve a building which is so symbolic of a person you disliked? The ensuing campaign successfully reduced the extent of the proposed work, but did not entirely halt the interior renovations, which are now complete. However, beyond that, I began to see there was a glaring absence in the crowds. Was it only architects who were campaigning for these buildings? Although I acknowledge my case studies were largely commercial buildings, the heritage significance was sorely disconnected from an understanding of social or cultural value outside of architectural communities. I wondered if the fight was worth it when the legibility of our efforts was minimal to a person on the street. While I was taking photos of the Portland building under renovations, a confused local stopped me on the street to ask if I knew what I was looking at and to reflect that they were pleased the building was finally being fixed. Back in Australia, I was fortunate last year to be involved in the preparation of an interpretive brief for the UK Union complex at the St Lucia campus, and although not postmodern in style, the retention of the complex was similarly contentious. However, despite an unsuccessful heritage listing, the consistent efforts of passionate campaigners established the living social and cultural significance of the place. This project demonstrates that the physical retention of places does not need to be a solely architectural pursuit, and the protection of places from the recent past is a powerful opportunity to capture living memory in future development. The next theme is that heritage preservation is also sustainable. And sustainability was not initially forefront of mind when I began this research, which largely focused on the historical development of heritage practices. However, the urgency of the climate emergency is beginning to highlight the valuable physical resources and embodied energy in existing buildings. And I think the recent completion of the 3XN and BVN's Key Quarter Tower has provided a valuable precedent for the viability of large-scale upcycling, although I query its claimed world's first status. The Portland building redevelopment was itself an exercise in unintentional sustainability. The building had major ongoing building issues. It leaked and always had. It was dark and unpleasant to work in. And ironically, the small square windows on the building's facade had initially been an environmentally conscious move to conserve energy in the wake of the 1970s energy crisis. Finally, the City Council commissioned a comprehensive study to look into options for the building, which was already heritage listed. Repairs would cost an estimated $95 million, but demolition and replacement would cost an estimated $400 million. The existing structure, heritage or otherwise, now held significant value. The final diagram for how the building would be retained is not dissimilar to the Key Quarter project. The existing iconic facade was entirely reskinned with a new insulated rain screen cladding, which visually replicated the original design, while the underlying concrete structure was retained. Interestingly, 2 blocks away, I noticed what I thought was a new building turned out to be a modernization project to reclad an existing 70s concrete structure in 2013, building with a very long name, the Edith Green Wendell Wyatt Federal Building. Closer to home, I've always been interested that Brisbane houses its own example in the State Law Building, which was formerly known as Camalco House, but is better known colloquially as the Batman Building. It was a similarly stark concrete building given a new identity through its redevelopment by Conrad Gargett in the 1990s. The trip opened my eyes to new and old examples which pave a way forward for the successful retention of buildings and their physical and economic value. Finally, I found myself learning a lot from the buildings that I had the opportunity to visit. The listing of postmodern places in the last 5 years has either reignited or simply coincided with a renewed interest in the movement. And having grown up years after its zenith, I had only ever heard about the debates that surrounded its emergence and the controversy of some of its pivotal designs. The benefits of a study tour like the Philip Y Bisset Scholarship is the ability to visit places for yourself, to walk around the entirety of a building and analyze it beyond the published photographs and journal articles. The following are snapshots of some lessons I learnt on my trip. The first is that postmodern architecture is contextual, and this might seem a little bit obvious to some, but their crazy, sometimes colorful reputation, as well as appearance, was entirely contradicted in practice, or at least in my visits, by how harmoniously postmodern buildings tend to exist in their cities. This is an example of a number of granite buildings adjacent to the AT&T building, which, viewed in context, sits quietly in a sea of arched public buildings. And rather than being harsh or imposing, it held its own. On a brief detour to Stuttgart, James Sterling's New Stutz Gallery had a similarly strong urban response and carved an inviting humanist space within an otherwise car-centric and contemporary German cityscape. And beyond the striking green mullions, I learnt a lot from the form and planning of the wider context. I learnt to look beyond the aesthetic and to see the underlying architectural and urban values, which is a mindset that's helped me in my subsequent work on the Gold Coast. I also learnt that postmodern architects were some of the first heritage practitioners, and I had known for a while that the chronology of the emergence of contemporary heritage practice and postmodern architecture aligned quite neatly, but it's unusual for postmodern buildings to be referenced as examples of heritage architecture. In my trip, I visited Stirling's extension to the Tate Britain and Venturi Scott Brown's Sainsbury wing, and in their own ways, these are both examples of heritage approaches. Similarly, Stirling's Tate Liverpool is an early example of adaptive reuse in a former wharf building. Terry Farrell's Coman Ching Triangle is a masterful integration of new commercial development in an existing streetscape while enabling legibility of new and old. And his Charing Cross Station, which is so often published with photographs of the Thames elevation shown here, actually knits curiously into the urban fabric and around existing heritage buildings and underground. It was interesting when I met with Jorge Otero Pelos in New York, who now writes about heritage preservation, that he found, I guess, drivers in his previous research in postmodernism. I also began to see that I too had a deeper connection with this research question, and there was a lot I could learn as an emerging heritage architect through studying postmodernism. Postmodern architecture could teach us about how to preserve itself. Ultimately, the movement of postmodernism is ongoing, and the practice of heritage architecture is growing. The problems and opportunities of this trip will live with me throughout my career as an architect, and I think having surprising and significant relevance to the future of architectural practice in Australia. The Philip Y Bisset Scholarship was a fantastic opportunity to pursue one of my passions and interests, and I would encourage anyone with the seed of an idea to patch together an application and let your enthusiasm guide you towards this generous and visionary scholarship. Thank you.
Much like Claire, my trip took place in the sort of middle half to the end of 2019. So it's been 4 years since I took my trip, and rather than sort of run you through a chronological recounting of the trip. I'm sort of going to do a much more irregular looping, sort of looking at some of the themes of the sort of my trip. So looking back, looking at historical examples of reclaiming the street, how modernist architecture, modernist and sort of pre-modernist architecture looked at how transport was transformed by the motor vehicle, how current cities are adapting away from using the motor vehicle as their primary means of urban planning, looking at the immediate future, forecasting what autonomous vehicles and other sort of trends in transportation mean for city planning, architecture, urban form, and then some speculation about recent occurrences that have sort of happened since the trip and while the trip was taking place. I was lucky enough to be able to visit a series of important buildings with a particular focus on housing. These were all designed during the period where individual motor vehicle ownership was a nascent phenomenon. As a general rule, these projects embraced the car as a positive occurrence. A particular moment of clarity came for me when visiting the Rudolf Schindler King Road house. At the visit, there was a display of historical photographs from the period of its construction. One was of the house sitting in an open field with farm workers surrounding it. This image has stayed with me. When I was taught about this building in university, the focus was entirely on the plan form and the pioneering construction methodology. What facilitated this open plan form and generous provision of green space? The complete abandonment of the city as a place for architectural experimentation in favour of the fringe, facilitated by a transport system required to make the urban fringe viable, the motor vehicle. This is not a condition limited to the Schindler House. The Roby House, the planned community of Usonia, Corbusier's Weisenhof Siedlung House, all of these share this same condition. So lots of those sort of projects that I've just flicked through. I believe that how this period of architecture is taught needs a dramatic reconsideration. Rather than a positive teaching of the composition and spatial relationship that was pioneered during this period, we need an approach that foregrounds the context required to make this spatial planning possible. Cars made available new land on the urban fringe and liberated modernist architects to plan spatially innovative buildings. The mass adoption of this approach generated urban sprawl and car dependency. So here is sort of a provocation of this piece of a house that I was taught to idolize, or a piece of architecture I was taught to idolize. And I think at the end of the trip and on reflection, I've slightly become radicalized that I believe there's a complete equivalency between urban sprawl and these kinds of buildings. At the same time as looking at where the adaptation away from vehicles as the primary transport means was taking place. The scale of the intervention I visited varied from small parklets and bicycle lanes to efforts to completely rethink the hierarchy of the street. The success of these interventions varied widely, but those which paired with density were almost universally successful. Many of the projects and interventions I travelled to have now been expanded. And I think it's important to note that often these interventions were executed in an efficient, low-cost manner. So as we can see here in Paris, all it takes is a graffitied traffic barrier, precast traffic barrier. The lack of permanent infrastructure does not seem to reduce pedestrian uptake of these liberated spaces. So the first example that we've just sort of started to flick through is the reclamation of the Seine Highway. So this is a roadway that used to be a major transport thoroughfare through Paris, and is now being transformed completely into a pedestrian and cycleway and also parkland. And as you can see, basically no other works apart from liberating this space has taken place. There's small interventions just to make it accessible, but beyond that, these actions can be incredibly cheap. So the next one is in Barcelona. So Barcelona has gone through a program of rethinking how the car is used throughout the city, both in the modernist, well, not the modernist, but both in the grid form part of the city and also in the newer sort of more sprawling parts of the city. So as we can see here, there was a focus when I was walking through these points of intervention to see how people occupying the space and the diversity of people which use the space. So this is all near the St. Michel markets. There's a sort of like pedestrian thoroughfare that's been created through there. And one of the key urban form tools that are used are these big plastic pots that stop cars from ever being able to transport through the place, provide shade, but I'm sure are incredibly cost effective. The sort of more formal parts of this in Barcelona are part of the super blocks project, where cars are being taken out from the central parts of the grid form of the city. So this project, which I was there for during the construction, has now been completed and I believe is incredibly successful. Ryan might be able to comment on during his visit to Barcelona, but you can even see here during construction, it's already being used and occupied, and the sort of construction off to the side is where that project was being extended. But those projects weren't limited only to the old parts of the city. The newer and more working class parts of the city were also intervened upon. And so we can see here, this is another square where transport, where cars used to be able to thoroughfare through, has now been completely locked off, and it's created a playground. Finally, of these examples is Oslo. So as part of in the response to, but also with broader sustainability. So there was a large terrorist attack in Oslo in the 2010s. I forget the exact date, sorry, but it was a terrible attack, and there was sort of an all of government review across how and what effects should take place. And as part of the response, there was a need to remove surface parking, or a push to remove surface parking. And because Oslo and Norway have like a very strong sustainability overlay, it was decided that they would sort of run with this entirely. The city council got on board, and there's a movement across the next decade to remove all surface parking from the center of Oslo. So that project is starting slowly. And as we can see here, these are some of the car parking spaces that have been taken up by parklets and are being slowly converted into pedestrian green space, overflow for bars, but also as just general green space for the public. And in some locations, overflows and playgrounds. So while I was in Oslo, I was able to attend the Urban Futures Conference, which is a leading European-based cities forum for planners, architects, and city officials, looking at different innovative responses happening throughout Europe and the States. And what was happening there was also that they were test driving this autonomous bus, which is part of a French company who's trying to roll out autonomous vehicles in France. We're probably all familiar with the autonomous vehicles as a concept now, but I think it's important to reinforce the speed that change is occurring. At the end of my trip, there were no publicly accessible autonomous vehicle trials that did not have a safety driver overseeing the operation of the vehicle. There are now two separate companies, Cruise and Waymo, running completely autonomous taxi services in San Francisco. What will be the market penetration of these services in 4 to 5 years? The other big topic at the conference was transportation as a service. The concept is basically what the name says, which is pretty similar to what we all do with public transport and taxis as it is currently. But this concept goes further and says that basically that these companies are going to replace all of transport and make it a complete service. So driving your car won't exist anymore, and vehicle ownership will be almost completely removed. So the impact of these two trends, autonomous vehicles and transportation as a service, were big talking points at the conference. And while some optimists were speaking about autonomous vehicles are pitched as reducing accidents, they don't get tired, they were pitching them as They have the ability to remove themselves from the city centre, so it removes all the need for car parking, for surface car parking. They were speaking about there's no labour costs, so the transportation will be cheaper. They can all be synchronised, so there won't be any traffic congestion. There was also a strong degree of realism from lots of transport officials that pushed back against this model of the autonomous vehicle being a nirvana for all transportation needs. So a couple of those key points for pushing back against were, who owns the road? Private corporations will have every incentive to saturate the road system with their vehicles to suck up as many users as possible and outcompete other providers. Rather than reducing congestion, this could increase it. Think about how Uber acted when it first arrived in Australia, flouting all regulation, offering artificially reduced prices, trying to push taxis out of the system. Imagine that, but on a 10x scale. They reduce the reduced cost of transportation will have an effect of increasing urban sprawl. And there's a lot of scholarship out at the moment and across the last 4 years that sort of demonstrates that as transportation costs are reduced, the effect on urban sprawl is going to be massive. So, and then while city centres may be able to dramatically reduce the area taken up by surface car parks, where will all these vehicles be stored? Where will they be serviced? That we're going to push the large dystopian parking lots out to the city fringe to further disadvantage these neighbourhoods. That the architect sleepwalk the revolution without working to understand the implications of both positive and negative of autonomous vehicles on the design of cities and housing. I lament that this topic is not a very active area of architectural debate and scholarship. In civil engineering and traffic engineering, and even in urban planning, this is a topic of active research. Even if the speculation and hype ends up not aligning with the outcome, at least the profession would have worked through multiple hypotheticals and have worked out strategies to compensate them. I don't know what's happened with my PDF here, but the image on the left here is a photo from when I was walking through a bike lane in New York that basically just said, that was basically saying, Mr. de Blasio, who was the mayor of New York at the time, don't build a bike lane in my neighborhood, don't take my park for a bike lane. And then on our right here, we can see an image of a poster of the of someone from, it's on the north side of Brisbane, protesting the extension of the bike lanes through that area, the Sydney and Jackson Street. So I think conflicts are inevitable, and the pessimistic part of me thinks that so much conflict is already occurring with the small amount of adaptation that is already occurring. The introduction of bike lanes being an example. People generally expect that they have some kind of semi-permanent ownership of the public land that is the street in their immediate vicinity. If this attitude isn't overcome, I fear that the wide uptake of autonomous vehicles will result in the intensification of urban sprawl and our increased dependency on motor vehicles. These are some maquettes from workshops that took place as part of the Oslo conference. The optimistic part of me looks at cities which have largely insulated themselves from the future effects of autonomous vehicles by tackling car dependency now. Hopefully, we can work towards this as our goal. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nick, Ryan, and Claire. I don't know about the rest of you, but I thought from three very, very different topics, they kind of just segued really beautifully, actually, and ended on a very futuristic note with you, Nick. So that flowed really beautifully, I think. I also just wanted to quickly do a little shout out to the selection panel. So for the participants in the room who are hopefully looking at putting in a submission. So we have Lee Shutter, who's an associate professor at Griffith, Elizabeth Musgrave, who's an honorary lecturer at UQ, Jim Gall, who is a practitioner and adjunct professor at QUT, Carly McMahon, previous emerging architect winner in Queensland, and then Christina Solomon, who did the Bisset Scholarship. And finally, I think just really a great big thank you to Philip Bisset himself, who donated a large portion of money so that we could do this every year. So that the funding comes from that bequest that he left. Interestingly, much like Ryan, his topic was on hospitals. And I guess his purpose was to have hospitals where people could, recover from sickness and accidents and create a better, more healthy population ultimately. We can thank him both for this scholarship, but also for some of the very good hospitals that we do have in Queensland. And he learned a lot about how to design those hospitals from travel. So that is the background of the scholarship. Thank you to Philip for making this possible and enabling Queensland students to travel and learn the way that he once did. And thank you to the 3 Bisset scholars for sharing their experiences today. It's been really, really great to hear from all 3 of you, Claire, Ryan, and Nicholas. Thank you all very much.